It is my huge pleasure and honor to be able to introduce Walter Salles to you today. The symposium we are holding today and tomorrow in his honor follows the conferment to him of the honorary degree of Doctor of Letters from the University of Reading. That was a ceremony that took place yesterday, and it was very moving for all of us. And we hope that this opportunity will help us to consolidate and develop further our already established cultural and artistic exchange. Walter and I are exactly of the same generation in Brazil, and in fact, I think that our birthday in April is just a few days apart. We were born in the same year, but I'm not going to say which year that was. We grew up in a country oppressed by 20 years of military dictatorship, followed in the early 1990s by the disastrous, though thankfully short-lived government of Fernando Collor de Mello. I hate to say this name. Even saying this name caused me the creeps. He was no less nefarious, though, than the president we have in power today. Having matured as an artist during this period, Walter gave us the most accurate screen translations of Brazil's difficult transition to democracy. The importance he acquired as the spokesperson of an entire generation cannot be overstated. He started as a documentarian who first branched out into fiction film with an adaptation of a novel by Brazilian crime writer Rubem Fonseca, A Grande Arte. I think it's called Exposure in English, right, in 1991. But he soon turned his camera to the political tragedy taking place in Brazil in the early 1990s with Terra Estrangeira, Foreign Land, co-directed by Daniela Thomas, which rediscovers in Portugal the colonial roots of Brazil's current woes. With the fall of color and the election of the neoliberal government of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Salles launched his most celebrated film, Central Station, Central do Brasil, ushering in a new sense of national identity that came to characterize the renaissance of Brazilian cinema from the mid-1990s onwards. Taking the world by storm, Central Station was the recipient of multiple awards, including the Golden Bear for Best Film and Silver Bear for its lead actress Fernanda Montenegro at the 1998 Berlin Film Festival, the BAFTA for Best Foreign Language Film in the same year, and 2 Oscar nominations. Endowed with a cosmopolitan outlook, Walter's work has put Brazil in conversation with the world. In Behind the Sun, the Albanian novelist Ismail Kadare is transported to the Brazilian hinterlands, the arid sertão. The Motorcycle Diaries brings to full fruition the Pan-American project at the heart of the Cinema Novo and Third Cinema projects. These and other films, such as On the Road and Linha de Passe, have been the recipient of numerous international awards and placed Walter Salles, as The Guardian has stated, among the 40 best filmmakers in the world. Anthony Minghella, after whom this building is named, and who also is a recipient of an honorary degree from this university, I'll show you the picture upstairs when we go back there, once said about Walter Salles, amid the bluster of the movies, one man stands out for the poetry of his films, Walter Salles. As well as making all these wonderful films, Walter is also a keen writer and film critic who has regularly collaborated with the Brazilian and international press. That means that he is a cinephile in the first place, and it is under this perspective that we will be focusing on him today, tonight. Tomorrow is a different conversation. He has repeatedly stated that The Passenger, directed by Antonioni, is the film that made him a filmmaker. This film, which we'll be watching in a minute, has strong links with Britain, as it was co-written by Peter Wallen, one of Britain's foremost film critics and thinkers. Sadly deceased in 2019, Wallen once stated in an interview with Lee Russell, apropos of The Passenger, and I quote, "After The Passenger went into production, I thought I'd achieved whatever goals I ever had as far as the industry was concerned. Antonioni, MGM, Jack Nicholson. So I turned to filmmaking myself, but as an experimental filmmaking, working with Laura Mulvey." And it's Laura Mulvey, the formidable founder of feminist film theory, and Wallen's former wife and filmmaking partner, that we have here today, but unfortunately not in person. She has had very serious personal problems, unexpected problems and private circumstances that prevents her from being in person here, but she will join us via Zoom, and you will be able to see and hear her on the big screen after the screening, and she will also be in communication with us all. It's hard to find words to describe Laura's importance to everything we do in terms of film studies and filmmaking. How can we not cite visual pleasures in narrative cinema in every class we teach and every paper we write? How can we escape her visionary insights into Hollywood experimental cinema and the female point of view expressed in seminal books such as Visual and Other Pleasures, Citizen Kane, Death 24 Times a Second, Stillness and the Moving Image, and After Images, On Cinema, Women and Changing Times. Her pioneering work in experimental cinema, including the extraordinary riddles of the Sphinx, is equally decisive to the history of cinema. I'm so honored that Laura has agreed to join this event and discuss with Walter Salles, my dear friend, what cinema has to offer us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd like to say just a few words. How moved and intimidated, I have to say, I am by your generosity, the generosity of everyone in this room, the generosity of the University of Reading. On a personal note, when I came to the age of getting to the university, there were no film schools in Rio. So every time journalists ask us, my brother who's a documentary filmmaker and myself, what's the best film school in Rio? We used to say, well, the history department at PUC, which is where we're from. So being in such an extraordinary film department in such a great university for me is a highly significant token, and receiving this prize is something I never thought that I would be invited to at some point. A writer I'm very fond of, Jorge Luis Borges, Argentinian writer, used to say that what interested him in literature was to name what hadn't been named yet. And I have the impression that Antonioni does that in The Passenger. I don't want to sail too much into the film right now because we're going to have the opportunity to learn from Laura Mulvey.
And from you.
And I'll try to ask the right questions to Laura. And so I wouldn't like to dive too much into this film, but I'd like to just leave an information that just a few years prior to shooting The Passenger, Antonioni almost shot a film in Sardinia and Brazil called Technically Sweet. The title, actually, of Technically Sweet, which was never filmed, is based on Robert Oppenheimer's sentence, which says that he had worked on the bomb, the atomic bomb, because it represented technically sweet elements that he wanted to solve. And that that screenplay, which was already written by Mark Peplow, Tonino Guerra, and Antonioni, kind of sets a frame for this film to exist. Structurally, it starts as a narrative screenplay, and then it jumps forward in flash forwards that are not directly linked to the narrative in Sardinia, which makes it totally surprising in a structural standpoint. And I think that lesson in Technically Sweet somehow echoes in this in Antonioni's The Passenger. I was very moved by it also by the fact that up to that moment, films questioned the society that they were part of. A number of films were very important for my generation. For instance, Memories of Underdevelopment by Tomás Gutiérrez Alé, a Cuban filmmaker, or Alice in the Cities by Wim Wenders, even Blow Up. All these films question the idea of identity versus the society, but didn't question the identity of oneself. And if the central character here, if he's escaping from something, he's escaping basically from himself to start with. And so this film was totally a pivotal moment for me. And I think for other filmmakers, Cecilia knows that Gia Genke, for instance, an extraordinary filmmaker that we both admire, has been extremely influenced by the film. I hope you enjoy either discovering it or seeing it again for the 10th time. Please enjoy it, and I'll be more than glad to learn with you, with Laura Mulvey, when I'll be back at the end.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Thank you. We did exchange a few ideas about how to start, so I'll let Laura eventually trigger this beginning.
Of course, I'd like to thank my very dear friend Lucien Najib for actually conjuring this occasion up. And I feel it really is a miraculous conjuring that I'm sitting here. I only wish I was there in person, but I can't be. But this is better than nothing. And it's been a wonderful occasion for me to think a bit about Walter's work. And because I've been ill, I haven't had a chance as much as I would have liked to, but also to think of his work in the context of The Passenger. And it's been a great pleasure for me to go back to The Passenger and look at it again in this particular context. And Walter, I'll just start by saying that looking at the context of your themes and your ideas and so on has been really illuminating for me. But we're going to go on and talk about that in due course. And I want to start in the way that this conversation demands, the way that Lucia has set it up, which is that in your interviews, you occasionally mention The Passenger as an influential film that made a particular impression on you when you first saw it. So let's start with just talking about how you first saw it, what the impression was, and just free associations around that.
Thank you, Laura. I saw the film for the first time when I was 16 years old, and I still remember the cinema, which was a large cinema, and it was a 10 o'clock session. The lights went on at the end, and I was about the only person in the cinema that couldn't stand up. And I was extremely moved and in tears, and I tried actually to answer this question, why, for 50 years exactly. this very same question. If you allow me to bifurcate through John Berger's idea that cinema is what takes us to an elsewhere, and in this sense, in cinema, we're all travelers. You know, this elsewhere that Antonioni brought me to or brought us to in the Passenger was truly unknown to me in many ways. Not only talking about the physical geography, the fact that you're in Chad at the very beginning of the film, and then moving from the desert to drifting through Germany, Barcelona, and then back to the desert in Osasuna. So the film is almost like a perfect circle, going to and back to the desert. But the way it talks about character truly moved me in a way that I hadn't been moved before. And strangely, you know, many films from that era showed or framed characters that were going through an identity crisis. And so that could be seen, for instance, in Alain Tanner's In the White City. That could be seen in a Cuban film I mentioned a little bit before called Memories of Underdevelopment, the Tomás Gutiérrez Alea film. You had that in São Paulo S.A., which is a magnificent film I'd love to share one day with you from the mid-60s. And of course, Blow Up also brought this question up. But The Passenger digs further into this realm because Locke is not only questioning the society that he's part of, he's questioning himself. You know, in fact, what he does question throughout the film, I have the impression, is his own conformity. The fact that he conforms with that society that he represents as a reporter.
Yes.
I actually like the title better in the original title, which is The Passenger, Profession Reporter. And this, in fact, the fact that contrary to the character played by David Hemmings, which I think was named Thomas in Blow Up, who was completely at ease with himself, comfortable with his own self, you have in Locke somebody who is utterly uncomfortable with himself and with his own sense of conformity, and he's aware of it. And this is what actually calls him perhaps to be tempted by the trading identities, you know, and in a way this allowed me and this allowed a lot of, I think, of other filmmakers or other friends to talk about our own conformity. You see, our own discomfort with ourselves in society, and the film allowed me to do so, to ask, you know, how much of Locke do we have inside of us? You see, and thus this link, and then I think I can drift to why it impressed me so much on a grammatical standpoint or structural standpoint, but I think it would be better to leave this for a little bit later. But anyway, the film truly marks a before and an after. You know, this is the film that completely destabilized me. I said, well, this cinema can be an instrument of change, and I didn't understand the magnitude of it, you know, until I saw The Passenger.
So just to be very literal about this, so you were 16, and what year was that?
That was probably no, that was more than 16, I have to say then. Making my that was 1975. I was 19. I apologize.
19. And so that was in what year? 75.
90, yeah, 90 times as the film was coming out.
As the film came out.
Yes.
So you caught it before it disappeared.
I caught it immediately. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. So, well, that's a really set up a number of themes that we could think about. But I wonder if this is a moment when I could say a few things about Peter Wallen and Mark Peploe, their collaboration, how they came to work together. I think the first thing to make very clear is that it was a cinephile. It was a friendship. It was a very deep friendship, but it was a friendship that was cemented by cinephilia. And in those in the 60s years, Peter, Mark, Mark's friend Claire, various other friends, a number of us, just spent our time trailing around the little cinemas of London looking for our favorite Hollywood films that had been recommended to us by the Cahiers du Cinéma. So we were discovering American popular culture, but refracted through the French. And this is very significant, because it's a way in which we were turning away from the Englishness of our country and our culture. What we saw, and I hope you'll see something of this reflected in the depiction of Englishness in The Passenger, a kind of sanctimonious self-satisfaction, a kind of sense of Englishness as being something unlike anything else in the world. This was very palpable at the time, and it turned our generation into leftists who loved Hollywood, but learned about Hollywood through the French. So this was a kind of triangulation. And I could go on about this for some time, but it's that I think it's that the questioning of English culture, English parochialism, English self-satisfaction, which I'm tragically afraid to say we see as having re-erupted in this country. So it's not something that's unfamiliar to us today, but it's something that we reacted against very strongly then and reacted through the cinema. And the cinema was one of our ways of articulating this. Also, there was just a love of Europe. Mark had been partly brought up in Italy, spoke Italian fluently. Peter was very, very influenced by all the new French theorists, read French totally fluently. And so there was a turning to Europe. And I think that sense of the exploring of Europe in the adventure of The Passenger is an adventure in Europe, but it's an adventure that reflects on English the kind of remnants of English colonial discourse, but also, Maud, I think this is what you pointed out very clearly, Walter, is that it's also a struggle to find a different way of thinking and a different way of articulating. And what's interesting about David Locke is that he's got to the point where he's conscious of this political dilemma, but he can't quite articulate it for himself or for anyone. And I'd just this might be a moment, it might not be the moment that we'd actually foreseen, but it might be a useful moment for you just to make a comment on the interview with the witch doctor.
Yes, if there is one scene that really encapsulates the film as a whole for me, it's that moment where Locke is starting to interview the witch doctor and fires a question, and the witch doctor listens, decants the question, grabs the camera, and inverts the point of view. And that inversion of the point of view is pure Fanon, Frantz Fanon, because he's not inverting only the camera on Locke, he's inverting also the notion of colonialism, you know, and therefore there might be something that links us in this moment with also all the forms of upheavals that were going through that age that you mentioned. That is the student upheavals in Paris in 1968, the civil rights movements in the U.S. and the war, the fight against the idea of going to Vietnam, the anti-colonial wars in Africa and South America. I would like to know how much of that was present, if you can share with us, in Peter and Mark's construction of the screenplay. How the echoes of that got to them.
Well, I think just to kind of narrow it down, this film is reflecting on the consciousness of colonialism and the inability of Englishness to articulate it properly politically. And so I think their interest was not so much in local struggles so much, but actually to throw this spotlight, rather like the camera turning round, to actually look specifically at what was happening in the previously colonized areas. And as Mark has pointed out in a recent interview, Vietnam, it was across Africa, there was Angola, as well as the war in Chad. And I think, although it might seem quite some time ago, it was 10 years earlier than than Mark and Peter were writing, it was the death of Lumumba, perhaps Patrice Lumumba, in 1961, was a very particular and traumatic, iconic moment in which a real beacon of a new hope, a new utopianism was assassinated, and that hope was kind of wiped out. And so I think there was that consciousness also of the fragility of the new movements in Africa and Southeast Asia and so on. So I think those were the overriding political questions. And both Peter and Mark would have been very conscious of that. And I think what we could say, if I could try and put their displacement away from their own English culture, their own class background, and so on, they then redisplaced through David Locke and his dilemma, and which in a sense was a dilemma very specifically of the reporter and the responsibility of the reporter, the ethical dilemma of the reporter, who's working for the well-meaning BBC, well-meaning but very constrained within its language, its discourse, and its ability to actually turn the camera around. And it's out of that difficulty, I think, that Locke's dilemma arises. I'll just say one other thing here, which I mentioned earlier, and I think you said it was worth bringing in, that in a very important way, television reporting had begun to change, in that 16mm cameras were beginning to be used. Once in the early 60s, the 16mm camera could be used for synchronized sound. It was a light, easy, little bit of equipment, I mean, nothing like the little bits of equipment that you carry around now, but in its day, it was a liberating little bit of equipment, and that's the 16mm camera that you see switched around in the dialogue that you were talking about earlier. So I think that's the way, because I think it's something that you've mentioned a number of times, Walter, is that you're interested in a way that a film might reflect its own moment and its own moment of crisis in a society, history of politics and so on. And I feel that it's not so visible in The Passenger, but I think the way that you've brought it out does make that political dimension very visible. But perhaps we could move on. And you were talking about the way that this is to move on more to Antonioni, unless perhaps we should stay with the script a little bit longer and then move on to the film, more to the film itself. From your films, it's quite clear that you're fascinated by journeys, by travel, by movement, and the relationship between the movement of the story and the movement of cinema itself as a moving medium. And the importance of that, the figure of the journey in The Passenger, is that something that you were interested in at the time, or is that something that struck you a bit more later on?
No, so the construction of that came much later on, but I would say that what ignited the interest in this form of storytelling was truly the Passenger. But
oh, really? Yeah.
But I guess that if we go way back in time, and I'm referring to a conversation with Wim Wenders once, and he said, the very first narratives, or filmic narratives for me, go back to the cave paintings in Lascaux and Altamira, and the reason for that is that they try to give a reflection of societies in movement at that time. If you remember, it's all about movement in those images. Men, how do you say that? Hunting, animals, seen at a distance, but always in movement. Therefore, I believe that this desire to leave a reflection of who we were in time is directly correlated with movement, and this desire to capture movement that you see much later in photography with Muybridge or with Edgar Marey in France is really something that I think that we carry within. It's something that comes with us, and with our necessity to somehow give a reflection of our identity in construction. This is what is interesting about road movies in general, is that they are about something that hasn't been fully crystallized yet. It's in the process of being crystallized, or it's in the process of rupture and transformation. So just an example, we could say that Easy Rider is a film about the end of innocence at the time of the Vietnam War, isn't it? It's also the first collision between a certain kind of conservative America with a generation that had other ideas and other desires on pulsating within themselves. Those films were the identity crisis of the characters somehow mirror the identity crisis of a whole society, I think are extraordinarily relevant and fascinating. You know, and I think these are the films that draw me that drew me to cinema, and this one even more so, because I can see the European crisis that you refer to of Britishness, but I can also see, from my Brazilian perspective, the questioning of who is handling the narrative. Shouldn't the camera be inverted? You know, I can see from my own perspective. I can see something that just makes this experience be polysemic. Polysemic.
Yeah.
You see. Yeah. I apologize for my very rusty English, but it's.
Well, we're giving you a bit of practice anyway.
Definitely, I couldn't dream of a better time for that.
That was very well put. But I mean, just to kind of extrapolate all that you've been saying, because you've actually laid out a number of different layers for us, or different arrows coming in to a certain point around and about movement, because you could say that we have a favorite love of the journey narrative, going back to folk tales, when the hero leaves his home and arrives somewhere else and has various adventures on the way, in which the road itself echoes the journey of the road, echoes the journey of the character and the journey of the narrative, etc., etc. But then, of course, as you were pointing out, that becomes really enhanced when it becomes cinema, because the movement then becomes literally movement. And then when you have the road and the cinema, you then have the vehicle. In your case, it could be on the road, it could be Motorcycle Diaries. So you have the mobility. The vehicle then carries the story, but it also carries the camera. So it then enhances the movement of the camera as well. So I think that's a really interesting point that you've made, because you've also connected it with how it involves the transformation of the camera, transformation of the character, whether it's a rite of passage into maturity, or whether it's, as we were discussing earlier, a death drive, the movement towards a compulsive movement, a drive. And I think I was asking you, and perhaps I could ask you again, is this sense of a journey, a drive, the drive of the motor car, the drive of the narrative, always touched in a small sense by the drive towards death?
Definitely, I think it's a great question, and it's also a point that reverberates throughout the film, and we could say that even the first flashback, and I would love to talk about the grammar of the flashbacks in this film, which is so unique. I think that when we see Locke and Robertson in the first flashback, just after Locke is changing the photographs in the passport and falsifying the passport, I think that Robertson looks at the desert and he says, "It's so calm, so still." That in itself incorporates the idea of a passing, of death is already in this dialogue, and then it's in another dialogue a little bit further along the line, where, for instance, when he's renting the car, Locke is asked, "For how long are you keeping it?" And he answers, "For the rest of my life." So that is not only that's not only an answer; it's an omen.
Oh God!
It's an omen of sorts, that I think inevitably allow us to see that the trajectory of the hero is the trajectory towards his own death.
Yeah.
You know, which.
So,
Go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted to interrupt for a moment. Do you know the story Appointment in Samara?
No.
Do you know it, Lucia?
I missed what you said.
Yes,
Can you
I
say it again?
Appointment in Samara.
Ah, no, I don't know.
I'll just try and tell it very quickly. I know this is a digression and I shouldn't do this. It's incorrect, but I can't resist it. It's an old Mesopotamian, I suppose, Iraqi story, an ancient story about a merchant sends in Baghdad, merchant sends his servant to do the shopping in the market. And the servant comes back pale and trembling and says, "Master, lend me your horse. I saw death in the market and I'm terrified. Lend me your horse. I'm going to go to Samara." And so he gallops off. The merchant goes to the market and sees Death and says, "Death said, why did you make that threatening gesture to my servant?" Death says, "It wasn't threatening. I was surprised. I was surprised to see your servant here in Baghdad. I have an appointment with him this evening in Samara."
It's a wonderful story.
Anyway, I sometimes when I think of The Passenger, I think of that inevitability, the trajectory.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I wondered if we could just go on and perhaps think a bit about more the film and the way that you were talking about the flashbacks, and something about the way that the camera. I mean, there are two ways I feel in which the way that Antonioni has made the film, this is apart from the script, is, as it were, also involves a kind of displacement from a very subjective point of view.
Yes, that's another really excellent question, because I think it allows us to really dive into the film. There's an essay on The Passenger that talks about the wandering camera, and it's true that since the very beginning, in the desert, the camera doesn't espouse Locke's point of view. The camera is not interested in being the subjective translator of the character. Actually, the shots in the desert starts sometimes, completely distant from Locke, and then ends up finding him almost accidentally.
Yes.
The sounds of the desert are also louder most of the time than the sound of dialogue, if there is any, because the signs become more important than the dialogue itself. The signs, for instance, for the cigarette. Therefore, everything in that world is destabilizing for Locke, because he's not in his habitat. These men in the desert, and the man who was going to lead him towards the guerrilla camp, are the real translators of that habitat, but he's not. And therefore, everything that in the film from the very beginning underlines what Antonioni had said, is that from The Passenger on, I became uninterested in the question of the subjectivity of the camera.
Oh, really?
And that is very perceptible. Yet you don't sense this effort. It is just there, and I think that it somehow also allows the flashbacks to be what they are. If if you remember the very first flashback, again when he's altering the passport, is preceded by a voiceover that we see later is coming from his recorder, that allows for a continuous shot in the present time, right?
Yeah.
Going up the walls. You see two flies on the wall, actually. And then that diverts into the desert, and we see a transition of space and time, because Robertson is there, and so is Locke.
Yeah.
So it's one of the very few examples where the flashback is brought in a continuous movement. You see,
it's absolutely extraordinary.
so it is extraordinary, and it somehow how do you say it redefines the codes of cinema, truly the codes of telling a story, espousing a character's point of view. This is not what is done here, and also altering continuously the sensation of time and space, which Antonioni does gracefully.
You talked about, sorry to interrupt, just to say that you've often talked about when you think of cinema, you think of time and space. I think you've said Antonioni, Bresson, time and space, but here it's a kind of tour de force of what cinema can do.
Yes, it is, and at the same time, you don't sense the effort. It's just very organic to the character, which is the character is being destabilized, from the very beginning, and so is the cinematic grammar. And yet these go, these two arrows of development go hand in hand. I have the impression that they are symbiotic in their drive.
Yes. I've just thought of something that I'd never thought of before, and so I just want to mention this, and then I want to ask you about the way in which Antonioni in the story, and the script and the Antonioni's direction often just open up cracks in a door to another world and to another possible story. And I think, we could cite the wedding in the little Rococo church in Germany, or the quarrel in the Gaudi house. But it just occurred to me that Locke goes to find Robertson because he hasn't got any soap. And he's going to find Robertson to ask for some soap. If Robertson had been there and alive, Locke could have said, "Could I have some soap?" and gone back and had his shower. And the story could have carried on another different trajectory. We could have gone back to the desert. Something else could have happened. But it's just this way in which the film and the script uses coincidence and chance, and uses it as a kind of narrative device. And so something that's almost just a kind of brief accidental encounter then is kind of switched around, destabilized, as you put it, and then takes off in another narrative direction. And I think this is something that you're interested in as well in your films, as just touching at various moments on possible other stories.
Yes, you were talking about bifurcations, and and I think that there are structural part of this form of cinema, of the road movie. It's the accident that somehow drives the story, as opposed to the screenplay that should drive it. You know, a little bit like in jazz, when an instrument just departs, you know, does something that the others just have to accompany in some ways, and then that instrument goes back, and you know, something collective can continue on that main road. The one example I like to give is when I shot the motorcycle diaries. If I can bifurcate to just one example in the film, once I was at the beginning, when I prepared the film, I was very moved by the photographs made by a photographer from Cusco called Chambi, who in the early 20th century was the first person to actually frame those who hadn't been on camera before. That is, you know, the peasants, the people who were not part of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie was what was framed, and he gave us. He was an Aymara native, and he gave us the reverse angle, a little bit like the witch doctor, you know.
Yes.
And in doing the motorcycle diaries, I somehow I had the intuition of doing those portraits of people that we met along the way, and the black and white portraits, where I just asked people to stand still, as if they were in a Martin Chamby photograph, except that it was in movement, except that they were in movement. And as we finished to edit the film, that was a family of images that didn't seem to pertain to the central story, you know. And then in playing with editing, at the end I said, well, let's try to bring this at the very end of the narrative, because at the end of the day, this is about unveiling not only a physical geography, but especially the human map, the diversity of faces that you have in Latin America. And in every single place that we've been, the faces were completely different. The human maps were so diverse. And then we had the end of the film.
At the end, it comes also like, it's rather like a memory. It for the spectator, it takes you back. It reminds you of certain moments, and reminds you of the faces, and reminds you also of the ultimate sense that this is a diverse place, but it's a place that belongs together.
I think that, you know, what I just mentioned brings up the idea of unpredictability, not as much, but intuition more than predictability. What you were referring to is more of the role of the dices, isn't it? Le jeu de dés that Mallarmé talks about, which is something that triggers so many different narratives, and it's so fascinating. What would have happened if?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, the dice had fallen another way. Lucia, how are we doing for time?
Yes, I wonder if this would be a good opportunity for us to bring in Peter Wallen.
Was just going to say something. Yeah, he was just going to say something.
Yes.
I was, maybe this is part of, because I was also going to ask something about Peter Wallen. Maybe we can do this together. Is that in Blow Up, the story is based on a Cortázar play, on a Cortázar short story, and reading the short story and seeing the Blow Up, you can sense that there is the source is there, but the screenplay departs so much from that source, and I wonder how much of the story that Mark Peploe had written, is it called Fatal Accident or something? How much of that was transformed into the screenplay of the Passenger?
I've been trying to remember. All I remember is, I mean, Peter and Mark had worked together on a script. Peter had given Mark a Heinrich von Kleist story called Michael Kohlhaas, and they, which was a revenge story, contemporary with Kleist, 18th century, and they transferred it into a Western. And they'd written a beautiful script, but it never got made. Then they wanted to make a film about the wild child of Aveyron. And when they were about quarter way through, they were told that Francois Truffaut was making a film called L'Enfant Sauvage. And so this obscure book that they thought nobody in the world knew about except Peter had found it somewhere in Paris, you know. Anyway, so they'd been working together quite a lot, well, on these projects, and always talking a lot. And then one day, Mark came with what I remember as just an A4 sheet of paper with the idea about the crisis of identity, not really worked out. And I don't know if there was another story called Fatal Accident, and if this is a false memory and something happened in between. But as I remember it, the idea had really come from Antonioni having this professional relationship with Carlo Ponti, and both of them wanting to make lower budget films. And what I think Antonioni said, I'd like to set up some European easy riders. So films that would be small budget, not well-known directors, etc. And so that's in a sense what he was pushing Mark to do, to set up a kind of European easy rider. And so I think it was on that premise that they went off and wrote the film. But as I remember, they actually, now we could have the photograph.
That's what I was suggesting.
Yes.
Andrew. Yes.
But because what they decided to do is start traveling in Europe. And I'll just say one other cultural thing, that I think the English bourgeois intelligentsia, in which we all came from, was much more familiar, certainly in my case, more familiar with France. You know, we could speak French, we could speak Italian. Didn't know Spain at all, partly, of course, because it was a fascist country. So this decision to go and explore Spain and to start in Barcelona was extremely radical, quite shocking in a way. And so then they were working on the script as we traveled. I just traveled with them from Barcelona down to Marbella, where Mark, through a friend, found that there were the plastic villas around the golf course were being rented for practically nothing, tuppence, as we'd say. So the photograph is of Peter and Mark working on the script together in this rather ridiculous plastic villa. Can you see it?
Yes.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can see the picture, and we can see that both have given up on their shoes.
Yes, kicked their shoes off. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lovely picture.
Yeah. So
think
that was, so the script was still in the process of development then. So they went on working on it when they came back to the UK, and went on working on it, I think, really till the summer. And then it went into abeyance for a couple of years, until it stopped being Mark Peplow's European Easy Rider and became Michelangelo Antonioni's substitute for Technically Sweet, which was going to be the Brazilian extravaganza.
Yes.
And you were saying that you had actually read the script of Technically Sweet.
Yes, here it is actually. Can you?
Oh, really?
Perhaps you
Yes.
could briefly
And Mark
explain.
worked on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Briefly explain what the
What the-
technically sweet is for those who came after your
So,
introduction.
Technically, Sweet is an ill-fated project that, in fact, Mark Peploe, Antonioni, and Tonino Guerra, and I think that Nicola, I'm missing a name, that there were 4 people working on this story that started in Sardinia, and the story is about 2 young men. One is a journalist already, the other one a student, and they are both infatuated by the same woman. And as the story of this relationship that becomes more and more complex continues, the narrative in the present time is suddenly intercut with flash forwards of a plane accident in the Amazon, where the two characters, the 2 male characters, in fact find themselves into the heart of the forest and have to survive in there. And interestingly, the cuts, the intercuts are such that the narrative is never truly linked between present and future, as opposed to the passenger. But it already shows that there's a desire for disruption in the narrative, in the narrative storytelling. The character of the journalist is also profoundly uncomfortable with his own profession and what he does in society in general. So there are some seeds of the passenger in Technically Sweet, and as you referred to, I think that the fact that Carlo Ponti pulled off the plug was a smart thing to do, because there are very few films done in the Amazon that got to the end.
And also, it was when Jack Nicholson's refused.
But then they sent him to the desert instead. I do need to make a brief interruption here to give a chance to the audience to also offer their ideas and questions. There are some points that we haven't discussed, like that incredible execution in the middle of the film, where it is a real execution. And Antonioni always refused to say how he got that footage and what is it from. Obviously, there must have been legal reasons for that, and his fear of having done something not permitted or something like that. So there is this incredible footage in the middle, and there is the final 7-minute shot where the camera very slowly but miraculously crosses the bars of the hotel room where Locke is going to be murdered in a minute, and we hardly notice that because the shots could have been the bang of a car door shutting, and the camera just goes out and goes all around, all over the place, as if it was in search of an object that it takes 7 minutes to find, which is the dead man. I don't know if I let you both answer to that, or if I ask the audience to bring in some more, because, well, let's say that we can go into the reception for 10 minutes maximum. So perhaps Laura and Wouter could say a few quick words about these things. And then
I would only say, I'd just like to say that I know that Mark felt very uneasy about the footage of the execution, and he felt that there was a certain way in which using really deeply traumatic material in a fiction film was not something that he was happy with. But I think I'd rather like Walter to talk about the last, it's not the last shot, the last but one shot.
The last by
Yeah.
one,
And also what would be interesting to know what he feels about the execution footage as well.
Antonioni, in talking about that sequence, he said, I wasn't truly interested about, the main character's death itself, because somehow I had treated this throughout the film. As you said, the whole journey of the hero, the anti-hero, is already defined by the fact that we're accompanying a very slow death. So in this moment, what hits me is the fact that death is seen as a part of nature, as opposed as the result of an act of violence that he refuses to frame. And interestingly, what makes this shot remarkable is the fact that it just moves slowly and is impregnated by different sounds and different movements in the frame at the end, beyond the bars. What is happening beyond the bars becomes more important than what is happening inside the room, where you barely hear the echo of the shot. It's as if he's more interested by the nature and the life going on than about about the end of that journey, and the way that the camera is when it passes the bar, it's as if it goes into another space and time again, until it flows back to that moment where again the question of identity surfaces. Locke's wife doesn't recognize him. When she's asked to recognize him, says, "No, I've never seen him." And the Maria Schneider character is the first one who grants him an identity at that point. Says, "Yes, I do recognize him." And so there's something quite unique in that scene, because it's at the same time a tour de force and it's an act of de-dramatization. It's not how do you say that? It's a betrayal of the thriller, actually. We have the impression that we're always seeing a thriller, but go ahead.
There are two things I wanted to ask you about that. Again, things that I'd never thought about before. One is, listening to you talk about it, to a certain extent, you could see it as a completely different, but still, in some sense, an iteration of the first flashback.
Definitely. Yes. I agree. I agree. It's the stillness of the desert and the stillness of that moment are part of the same circle in a way.
So in a way, it's almost as though there was some echo between the one and the other. And the other thing I just wanted to mention is that I feel that to have seen Locke, as it were, being killed is, in a sense, to break with some of Antonioni's. I mean, this might not be true in his other films, but I feel it's certainly true in The Passenger, that there's a certain respect for reality, in the sense that to show an actor being, as it were, murdered would be a travesty of that respect for reality. Does that make any sense?
It does.
It does. And
Anyway,
on that
so-
note, yes. Can I invite burning questions from the audience? Be quick, raising your hand. Yes. So yes, please.
Yes. So I think Antonioni made Chongguo China like 3 years before the Passenger. if I'm not mistaken.
Lucia, I can't hear. You'll
Okay.
You'll
Yes.
have to translate it for me.
Okay.
Should I speak
You'll have to
up?
tell me.
Yes.
I think Antonioni made Chongguo China, like this documentary, like 3 hour
Yeah.
documentary about.
Antonioni made China just before
yeah.
that, three years before.
And
Yeah.
it was a beautiful film, totally sincere and honest. He was kind of like playing with the people and,
Yeah.
and flirting with women a little bit, and it was a beautiful film. The Chinese were horrified, and they told him so, and he was probably traumatized by that.
Yes.
And this
So
maybe
that
feeds into the.
just hold on a second. So Antonioni was
Yes, I
having.
can hear now.
Okay.
I can hear.
Okay. So carry on.
So maybe I don't know how much that fed into this the story of the Passenger, where the camera's reversed and this colonialism is put on trial. Whether it's this kind of shift in the ethos of European cinema, or if it's Antonioni's issue, or it's Peter and Mark.
Well,
And
okay.
the other thing was the film made by your Joao about the family butler, where he agonized that.
No
But
penso
after 10
agora.
years
What
about
is the time?
No, Santiago.
Oh, Santiago.
about addressing his own.
Ah, okay,
disability.
Santiago. Okay. Thank you very much. So I think the question is those reversal of perspectives. One of the filmmaker who's having fun or finding it beautiful, and then the Chinese totally rejecting the ensuing images. And the question of Santiago, made by João Moreira Salles, about his brother, about his own past and his butler. And I think there is an assumption of guilt by João inside the film of not understanding and not letting him speak of his own problems. I think that's the central question in Santiago. So for
I think this is a question for Walter, not for me.
Yeah, I think that it's a very good relationship, and definitely, I mean, the position of the taking the sentence of the witch doctor, saying that the question tells a lot about you in the most positive manner than my answer could actually give. I totally agree with your perception.
Great. More questions from the audience?
I'm curious about the technicality of that shot. If Walter Salles could talk a little bit how the camera actually goes through the ball.
The final.
The final shot, yeah, the last, that 7-minute long take.
Well, that apparently came as a solution, when Antonioni was scouting at the Hotel de la Gloria, yes, and I think that the solution drifts directly from the fact that the shot should be as gradual as Locke's death itself. So that sense to be drifting through space and time should be gradual, and as soon as you hear the shot, the camera goes through the bars and frees.
Yeah, but how?
Because you should see Locke's death as a liberation.
But the camera is much
The
bigger than the
liberation-
space between the bars.
Technically, this was done with a gyrosphere, which is what makes the shot be stable. So you run it. It was running on how do you say, cables that would stabilize the camera, and then the bars are in fact detachable. So when the camera gets to that point, the bars were open and then went back. What I think is striking in the shot is the fact are the glimpses of life that reverberate throughout that shot. The woman driving a car, Maria Schneider walking, because she anticipates, she understands what is about to happen. That encounter with death is something that is pulsating through the film, and she is the one who says, "You should keep the appointment," and she does that in order for him to fulfill his whole journey. His journey would have been incomplete without the death itself, you see. And the beauty of that is how all these elements are congregated with, and then with the arrival of the police car and the rush inside again, but the rush inside conflicts with the idea of the peasants. There's boi, como é que se fala? Uma charrete.
An ox
There's an ox with
a cart, a carriage.
yes,
yeah.
going very slowly, which contrasts with the police car arriving too late, because it's a film about people who are not in. It's a film about asynchronia. How do you say that?
Asynchronicity.
About asynchronicity as well. Locke is in asynchronicity with himself. The police is in an asynchronic position with what is going on, and so is Locke's wife. The only person truly in synchronicity with Locke is the Maria Schneider character. So the shot somehow brings all of this together in that one specific moment.
I need to give the word to Alistair now, and yeah.
I'd like to pick that up because I felt watching the film again very aware of the Maria Schneider character being inhabiting a different time than Locke, and being aware of a future time he's unaware of. But I'd like to put that in the context also of thinking about the film in relation to vendors and Alice in the City.
Can you hear it, Laura? This is Alistair Phillips.
Wait till the end and then just give me a
okay.
minute, yeah.
I was thinking how you also in Alice in the Cities, which I can't remember whether it's concurrent with The Passenger or...
I think it's a
Yes,
little bit early.
74.
74.
So
yeah.
you have these sorts of you have an older man and a younger female character in this interrelationship. One is more sort of future orientated, and at the same time embedded in that relationship as they're moving in the journey narrative, they're moving through a landscape which is both holding the past that's been and the future that's coming into view. And I see that very much in The Passenger as well, mirroring their relationship, the younger female character and the older man, mirroring the future of Spain, a different kind of modernity that's visible in the mise-en-scène in relation to the older.
Yeah, I can see a new essay for the screen journal here in this question by Alistair. Fantastic question, but I don't think we have time. But I'll just summarize briefly to Laura. He thinks that the character.
I think it's more. I got most of it. I think it's a question about, especially around Alice and the relations between
it's the question
generations.
of inhabiting different time frames. So of the younger female
it's
and
really,
the older.
really interesting question.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that before.
And a different kind of modernity too.
Yes.
It's true that in both films, the female character is what lends identity to the to the characters they are confronted by. Either if it's Philip Winter, which is the name of the photographer of Alice in the Cities, or David Locke. If we take the Wenders film, the sense of finding his destiny only happens because she finds where her home is, and he is in fact the passenger that helps that to happen, right? And in The Passenger, the Maria Schneider character does allow this transition also to happen, defining what the end of the journey will be. So they both, it's interesting how those two films were probably made at the same time without one having the knowledge of the other. Although Wenders is so influenced by Antonioni, I think that his film anticipates The Passenger by 1 year, maybe, or 2 years. It's just that something was already floating in the air, and that those two stories truly are reflections of that sense of displacement and understanding of your own reflection in society.
Just to wrap up, because we really don't have time for more questions or answers, I would like to go back to that phrase, that quote by Peter Wallen that I mentioned at the beginning. Laura, I quoted that statement that Peter made, that after having made the script for The Passenger, everything that I could expect from the industry was achieved. So Antonioni, MGM, Jack Nicholson, so I had nothing else to expect from the industry. So I went off to make experimental films with Laura Mulvey. So my question that will remain in the air, I don't expect us to have time to discuss that, is how much from The Passenger then filtered through the cinema that you and Peter went on to make, including the Riddles of the Sphinx, which is...
I would say not at all, but I do think that it's important to look at the at a kind of post face. I see a balance, a symmetry between Peter's work on The Passenger and his film Friendship's Death, which is again about, I don't know if have you seen that, Walter?
No, I did not. But I will.
Again, it's a film about a journalist who gets displaced, but actually, I won't say more about it. But I think there's a really interesting way in which you can see the themes working through there. But I think in terms of the movies we made together, we had very different kinds of
preoccupations. Could I just say one last thing?
Yeah, sure, of course.
I'm taking you all away from your wine.
This is very bad. I just wanted to say, struck in Walter's interviews, the way he talks about the cinema as a fossilizing medium, as a medium that captures a particular time and space and holds it. I just wanted to end with my thoughts about Barcelona, because, as I said, I had never been to Spain before. Spain, being a fascist country, was kind of rather anathema. But at the same time, in a very strange way, we were there in the early 70s, which was coming to the end of the Franco regime. It was the last tolling of the bells for the Franco regime. But it had been there since the late 30s. So the whole country, and Barcelona particularly, you felt had stayed what you could call in aspic, had not changed. And so it was almost like visiting a city in the 70s that was the same as in the 30s, and its culture, its nightclubs we went to, hadn't changed over that time. And then when I went back to Barcelona, say some 10, 15 years later, how disillusioning it was that capitalism had flowed in, and the Ramblas was full of McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and so on. But there was that way in which that sense of time standing still in history, in that appalling period of fascism, just related, I think, to some of the ways in which you've talked about cinema preserving places and time as well. Not that I'm, I mean, probably Kentucky Fried Chicken had to come. What can one do? What can one do? But it was very interesting to see, this was when we were there in 1970 on the way, not when the film was being made, when we went back, but it was very interesting to see a place that had more or less stayed unchanged.
Laura,
So,
what can I say?
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Have a lovely reception.
Yeah, yes. We are so sorry you were not here with us.
I
But
know.
thank you so very much indeed. I think it was a most wonderful conversation.
Oh, well, I
so
really enjoyed it.
enriching,
Terrific.
so beautiful,
Thank you
such
so
a
much.
privilege. A round of applause to those two stars.
Good night, everybody. Have a lovely time.